My name is Chris Chase from South Dakota State University. I'm a professor there, and I have been there since 1992. I'm a veterinarian and was involved in veterinary practice for about 30 years, and then I have been involved with research for the last 25 years. Most of my research is involved with cattle, particularly with the immune response of cattle to viruses and just to different production schemes. I also have started a company called RTI, so we do contract research for various animal health companies in the U.S., and we're interested particularly in mechanisms that have to do with immunology. One of the things that has really fascinated me over the years is bovine respiratory disease, which is also known as shipping fever, and really a big problem in the cattle industry. And the interesting thing is that we put lots of time and money and effort into coming up with solutions by looking at the bugs, by looking at better antibiotics. The interesting thing is the disease incidence hasn't been decreased a bit. So it became clear to me that we need to spend more time looking at management issues as they relate to cattle, and particularly as it relates, I think, to how we handle cattle to try to minimize stress, and also in terms of being able to how can we manage them in terms of diet and dietary intake. So we've spent probably the last 5 or 6 years at South Dakota State really assembling a team to begin to look at that, particularly as it relates to immunity at the gut level and the microbiome. And so to talk a little bit about the gut in particular, particularly in young calves, is giving them diets in which we can try to have the least amount of change that can occur. We've also looked at using different nutraceuticals in terms of the effect that they might have on immune response and on immune responsiveness. And we found, though, in general, again, just our management of calves, beginning with colostrum, because it has a big effect in terms of both immunity, but also in terms of what goes on in the gut, is really important. These animals, as they begin to use their fat stores, really are at a much higher inflammatory situation. So trying to minimize that. So trying to do as few things as possible, trying to get our feed changes to be as minimal as we can and make that transition more gradual is important. And then trying not to do too many things like vaccinating during that early fresh period, and then trying to minimize heat in particular, because we know that heat abatement ends up being a huge stressor, particularly in dairy cattle, and their gut health is affected in a couple different ways. We know with heat stress, one of the things that happens is that the animal trying to cool itself down, that blood is diverted away from the intestinal tract into the skin, and that then results in less blood being delivered to the intestinal tract, so the intestinal cells themselves just aren't in as good a shape as they should be, so that makes it more likely that we might see leaky gut. And the other thing, obviously, that occurs with heat stress is just decreased intake on the microbiome. And just to remind you, the microbiome are those organisms that we find in the intestinal tract that are normally there, most of them. We know there's about 10 to the 14th, lots of them, so not enough zeros I can even think of, that are present. And most of them are there as commensals or as organisms that are important for the health of the animals. And maintaining the right balance of those is really important, so that things like salmonella and other organisms, E. coli, that we associate with intestinal diseases don't get a foothold. So through that early lactation phase. So being able to manage the gut really is important, both in terms of from a microbiome standpoint, but also in terms of the health of the animal, in terms of immune response. And we also know that, again, if we have too big of a disturbance in the intestinal tract and get what's called leaky gut, and again, that's where the intestinal cells just aren't as healthy as they should be, and part of that might be from inflammation, can also affect then the other systems. So if we have inflammation that occurs in the intestinal tract, that will also have an effect on the respiratory tract. So we may see more pneumonia, may have an effect on the mammary glands, so that we'd see more mastitis, have effect on the reproductive tract, so that we might actually see more metritis and more infertility problems. So being able to manage inflammation is really important. And as we look at some of the good and I think new novel preventative treatments I think we're going to see that one of the biggest things they do is just help us maintain what we call homeostasis in that microbiome, so that microbiome is in its best stead in terms of not too much in terms of some of the bad bugs and just the right number of the good bugs. And at the same time, that's going to help us in terms of keeping the immune response and the intestinal tract right literally on track. Because typically what we want that intestinal tract to be is anti-inflammatory. And we know that, again, that with some probiotics that we use and obviously higher roughages, that will help us in terms of doing that.